A partisan politics dominating the country as we gear up for the 2020 presidential election. But there are some people who are finding common ground, especially when it comes to protecting homes, land, and towns from natural disasters. Catastrophic fires are threatening up to 80 million acres of national forest, and this could affect more than 46 million homes.
Former Arizona Senator and CBS News contributor Jeff Flake traveled to his home state to check out efforts to tackle wildfires and save the forest. He met with people putting aside their political differences to help protect the land.
Still left a few trees right there.
Stretching almost continuously from the Grand Canyon to New Mexico and into the White Mountains here in eastern Arizona. This is the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. Imposing as it may be, much of it is unhealthy.
Wow, chimney left.
That's a nice looking chimney.
For nearly 20 years, environmentalist Ethan Almack has worked to restore these forests. He runs the Grand Canyon Trust.
Well, I would represent those who didn't have a voice, whether that be Mexican spotted owl or other wildlife species.
As Almack puts it, he speaks for the owls.
I'm a registered independent, but I'm about as left-leaning as they come on many issues.
Well, you notice even while we're talking, I'm leaning to the right and on my left, right? So, been very conservative, grew up in a very conservative household. This is an area that was treated.
David Tenney's family has owned sawmills for more than a century. And then came the timber wars of the 1990s.
Your family getting out of the business, was that by choice, or what happened there?
No, absolutely not. Here, the fighting basically started over the Mexican spotted owl. There was an environmental movement that was trying to get the Forest Service to change the logging practices.
So at that point, there was a lot of animosity. In 1993, the environmental community put forward a lawsuit suggesting that the Mexican spotted owl needed additional protections. The courts agreed, and that logging ceased.
Then, in 2002, the Rodeo Chetasky fire blazed across nearly 500,000 acres of Arizona's forest.
It shut down the economy to the entire region for pretty much the whole summer. It caused everybody to step back and say, wait a minute, we can't do this. We can't keep doing nothing.
There needed to be broad community support for going back out into the woods and doing the right thing. No one could be left out.
After decades of distrust, Almack and Tenney and dozens of other stakeholders started hammering out a deal to restore the forests.
What did you think when you think of people like Ethan here, people on the environmental side?
You know, there was a time I wouldn't have give you dynamite to blow them all to smithereens. I really wouldn't have.
What were the main impediments from your perspective?
Well,
trust.
From our perspective, trust was an impediment.
It was never going to go back to the big timber, right, to the way we knew it, but it didn't have to just burn either.
They agreed that the forests were far too thick with trees and needed to be thinned. So they set out to restore 2.4 million acres of dense national forests.
We've also agreed that most of the trees that need to be taken out are small, and that we're going to leave the larger and older trees as is. Fires burn through these forests very frequently.
If there are more trees closer together,
that's right,
then it becomes a crown fire, which is what?
When you get hundreds and sometimes thousands of trees per acre, fire will run continuously through those trees. And it's really quite difficult, usually impossible, to control that fire once it's running through the canopy, especially with strong winds driving it.
Well, they look busy here.
Yeah.
Some industry has returned to these woods.
My grandpa always said those weigh 16 ounces to the pound.
But David Tenney has left the logging business and moved into government. He's the newly minted director of Arizona's Forestry Department.
The fact that the two of you can sit down, sit across a table, given your background and where you came from, should that say something to the country?
Yeah, I think it should.
I trust Dave implicitly to represent my interests in the best way he can, and vice versa. And beyond that trust, we have a friendship.
Still, this is federal land with all the bureaucracy that entails. Since 2010, Forfry has only thinned about 113,000 acres, falling well short of its annual goal of 50,000 acres.
We have been supporting the Forest Service and pressuring the Forest Service to do what it needs to do.
In Washington, we're obviously always consumed budget time, appropriations process, and the difficulty has been to appropriate enough money to fight fires and still have enough money to prevent fires.
Exactly. Jeff, the studies have shown that it's about 10 times more expensive per acre to put out the fire than to treat the acreage ahead of time.
So this work makes sense economically, it makes sense for the communities, it makes sense for the forest, for the environment. It's a win-win-win-win-win.
So we want to welcome former Arizona Senator and CBS News contributor Jeff Flake to the table. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, normally when we see stories like that, you cut back and forth with the people because they're never in the same room together, right?
Good point.
Yeah, the thing about trust came up over and over again, and I just think about Washington and how much trust has been lost, and how people leaning on the left or the right almost at times seem to be operating with a different set of facts. Mm-hmm. What can Washington learn from these two men and what's happening in your state?
Well, I don't think we can overemphasize how difficult this was for the environmental community and the logging community to get together, as well as a lot of other stakeholders involved. But we had that devastating fire in 2002 that took 500,000 acres of Arizona's pristine forest. And so all sides just decided, all right, enough of this. We've got to do something different, and they came together, and it took a couple of years. It really did for them to hammer out a proposal. But basically, the logging community said, "All right, we'll give up on this idea of taking, large diameter trees." And the environmental community said, "All right, we won't have lawsuits that will prevent the Forest Service from allowing the thinning to come in, because we need private industry in the forest to help the government, thin the federal forest." And so it's a win-win-win, as was said. But it was difficult coming together, but they just felt they didn't have a choice.
So they're focusing, it seems to be, on managing the forest, right? The area where there's a lot of dispute is about climate change. The president has been sort of criticized for choosing not to talk about climate change and instead talking about managing the forest. Are they also choosing just to not talk about the most controversial component of this and just focus on what they have in common?
In Arizona, everyone agrees, whether it's climate change or not. I believe it is, certainly, but we've had a 25-year drought, and it has left the forests there really in danger, along with the fact that we haven't had private industry in to thin where we need to. But way back when, before the forests, before people came and settlements started and ranchers came in and everything, there were about 50 to 75 trees per acre. Now in some places there are up to 1,000 or even 2,000 in some cases trees per acre, and it's just not a healthy situation. So the forests have to be managed, particularly these federal forests, and but you've got to have all sides agreeing not to have lawsuits that will slow the thinning that has to come in. And you have to have industry say, all right, we'll lessen our expectations about what we can log.
So reasonable.
And it happened. Anyway, it's a good news story with people who had intractable positions, we thought, have come together.
And we should note that this is a story that is a part of your Common Ground series of bringing unlikely sides together, and we'll see more from you.
We will.